On today's World Insight, an 11th hour court ruling against the looming TikTok ban in the US. What's next for the popular social media app?
If you read the first draft brought by the TikTok and the oracles, they designed these technical solutions to ensure the US individual data can be stored in the servers inside the United States.
And relations between China and Japan under a new prime minister. Likely cooperation between Asia's two top economies.
And he has a slightly different stance in politics in overseas. But economics, he may succeed Abenomics, which Prime Minister Abe started.
Hello and welcome to World Insight. I'm Tian Wei in Beijing. We begin today's program with the troubled app TikTok. It received a reprieve of its ban from U.S. app stores on Sunday after a federal judge in Washington granted a preliminary injunction blocking an order of President Trump. The ruling comes hours before TikTok was to be removed from the mobile app stores. U.S. District Judge Carl Nichols, who was appointed to be on the bench by Trump in 2019, filed his decision. TikTok has been embroiled in a push-and-pull saga with President Trump for the past 2 months as it races to make a deal that will allow it to keep operating in the United States. It's proposed an arrangement that would create a new entity called TikTok Global that would include investments from Oracle and possibly Walmart. What does this temporary ban mean to the future of TikTok, especially with the election coming up in November in the U.S.? Let's talk to our guest. On TikTok, the latest in Shanghai, I'm joined by Shen Yi, director with the Fudan University's Research Center for Cyberspace Governance. In Los Angeles, U.S., William Li, chief economist from the Milken Institute. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Waking up to the news, it's exciting. All the twists and turns. Mr. Li, what does it really mean, this field of opinion, and what would that mean for September the 30th?
Well, I think the judges allowed the two sides to have a little bit more time to get the negotiations completed, or at least more certain about the outcome. Because right now, as far as we're concerned in the United States, the issue of national security has been raised. The court has discussed it and said they haven't come down with a final decision, but there is an extension of time. And I think the key now is whether the Chinese authorities will approve the terms of the deal that is on the table right now. And I think it sounds like the president and the national security people are relatively happy with the situation as it now stands.
Professor Shen, what's your take? What's likely to be the new opportunities, so to speak?
The new opportunity is that the United States come back to a more normal track to dealing with these deals based on a more reasonable discussion of these issues, which means find out practical ways based on deliverable technology options, and so that the TikTok can make a good deal with the United States to solve the reasonable concern of national securities and finding a balance of this information, the internet users and the profit, the profit of these TikTok companies.
What would happen from now until September the 30th, which is a time the court gives?
To these two guys, Oracle, Walmart, and TikTok, or any people's concern is deals. They need to make a more dialogue, communications, make a more proper and balanced draft of the final deals, the first. And the second, I think the U.S. side, especially inside the White House, need to come back to the normal status, which means take a more fair, balanced attitude to look at these reviews, to give up those overestimate of the so-called national cybersecurity concerns, so that we can have a normal atmosphere to push forward this deal.
One of the points raised by the lawyer from the TikTok side, Mr. Lee, is about the First Amendment. Of course, that's concerning freedom of expression in the United States, very well known. So how sound will that argument be for a multinational company such as TikTok, which is headquartered in China?
Well, the First Amendment rights are concerning the ability of our citizens, the U.S. citizens, to express themselves, and surely anyone who is on the TikTok platform is able to express themselves. I think the separate issue is who controls the data after the expression has been made. Are the people who made it, or are the owners ByteDance and TikTok? If it's ByteDance and TikTok, that means they can do whatever they want with the data, which includes passing it on to anybody else. And that's, I think, one of the deep issues now we are facing on the internet as the ownership of data. So I think the First Amendment right is already there. The real issue now concerns ownership of the data after it's been released into the internet. And I think that involves the national security concerns because, as we all know, a lot of the companies within China are obligated, if asked by the authorities to turn over the data, they have to do so. So the ownership issue comes down to who owns the data that's generated in the United States by U.S. citizens on the U.S. platform of TikTok.
Okay. And Mr. Shen, of course, it's interesting that Oracle comes into the overall final discussion. Chief executive of Oracle is well known for having some close relationship with both the Republican Party and the current administration. Having said that, though, how much of this do you think is about setting a precedence of multinational tech companies operating in the United States? Will they only apply to Chinese companies, or will the picture becoming even bigger?
The first is a very typical misreading of the so-called Chinese companies have these national security obligations to deliver the data as what the governments want. Frankly speaking, any companies, including especially United States companies, have such kind of duties and obligations according to U.S. law systems and the case. And the second, there is a very typical technical solutions to solve these issues. You can locate U.S. data inside the U.S. servers or in certain servers, and you can monitor the net flow or data flow of these servers to find out whether this data has been transferred or not. If you read the first draft got by the TikTok and the Oracles, they designed these technical solutions to ensure the U.S. individual data can be stored in the servers inside the United States so that the oracles can monitor the data flows. Actually, we have lots of such kind of examples. If you have reasonable concern on these things, we can finding a practical technical solutions for it. But if your concern based kind of misreading and misperceptions, that will make things tough. And go back to these oracle things. I think these Oracle, they try to finding this as kind of opportunities. They can enter into this market so that they can take advantage of its identity based on its good relationship both with its administrations and the republics, so that they can first enter this market, got cooperation with TikTok, and based on their servers, they can make profits and monies. And the second, they can help the TikTok to make more persuasive solutions, become more confident. You not worry too much about so-called these data security issues.
What about the role of Chinese government? Earlier, the Chinese side has put forward the new regulation regarding what kinds of algorithm can be used outside the Chinese border. So, Mr. Shen, how will this, in a way, have been swaying the picture we see?
First, to all countries concerned national security in the cyber world, they all should take a kind of regulation of such kind of technologies so that they can protect their national security interests more effectively. And the second, in these very practical deals, when the Chinese government passed this modification of the technology regulation law systems, is at a very interesting timing. At that time, TikTok faced the bullying from both U.S. companies and the U.S. governments. And this modification of these systems providing the possibility that Chinese government have effective law systems to protect the Chinese companies' lawful interest overseas.
Mr. Li, this is going to set an interesting precedence, possibly, in two regards. One is how data will be handled, how multinational companies will be operating inside the United States in terms of tech sector, and how much politics will be involved. On the other hand, this is likely to set a precedence about how Chinese and American tech companies are likely to work together, at least in this very uncertain time. Interestingly, we see this is all happening right before the November election. Mr. Li, how do we see all of this mixed up and the reality today?
Well, I think the TikTok issue has become such a big issue because we don't have a good trade deal, a phase 2 trade deal that protects intellectual property and a framework for dealing with multinational transfer of data and the ownership of data within a multinational corporation. Those are the issues that had to be ironed out in the phase 2 deal with a framework for protecting intellectual property rights and for cyber trade. And that's something that is yet to be done. Unfortunately, the trade talks have broken down to the point where, because of our elections and other issues, they haven't continued. So what you see now is the consequence of the absence of that framework, which we've talked about before, has been such a vital part of the negotiations between China and the United States. I think what we've learned from this is that the political issues, both countries, China and the U.S., want to protect the property rights of the companies within their jurisdictions. And certainly China's concerned that the AI advances, which China has done leaps and bounds over, has to be protected, and that's understandable. But I think the privacy issues in the United States are also a paramount concern. And as I said earlier, the issue of ownership of data, and as Mr. Shen said, the protection can be taken technologically, but the legal issues of ownership still have to be decided, because who owns the data that are produced and reside within the United States? Is it the producers of the data? Mm-hmm. Is it ByteDance? Is it TikTok? Who is the owner? And that is the issue that I think has to be resolved in the courts.
So I guess it's also a precedence the U.S. has set that's likely to also have a huge impact on its own operations of companies and also intelligence abroad as well.
Well, the whole issue of data security, I think, is paramount for telecommunications as well as data generated and data storage. And I agree with you that I think the absence of a framework that is agreeable for both sides and a multilateral agreement that where the rules of the internet have yet to be determined. And so Europe, United States, and China really have to sit down in negotiations for deciding how we conduct ourselves on the internet in the 21st century. And those rules haven't been decided. And you see this hodgepodge of deals, whether it's a commercial deal like TikTok or security deals about privacy of phone calls. Those are issues that have yet to be resolved.
Mr. Shen.
I think that's very interesting questions. But first, before Trump take this office, the U.S. and China already begin the negotiation on these things. And the second, China, United States, and European unions, and India, Russia, all these countries are trying to develop their own understandings how to regulate these data transport, classified regulations, how to protect intellectual properties. But there's one thing, a very critical question, whether such kind of regulation should be based on more balanced principles or an unbalanced, self-centered principles. Here the real challenge is the United States, especially this government, want to launch a kind of very selfish principles, which means the United States can use its advantages to do everything or anything in the cyberspace, and all the other countries can do nothing, only with the U.S. allowance. Then they can do very limited things.
Let me make it clear that the negotiations that the Trump administration has conducted has really tried to benefit both sides because we've taken a bilateral approach so we can address the specific issues of China and the United States. And we were making progress in the phase 1 and going into phase 2 talks. So I think the issue now going forward is to continue bilateral negotiations where both sides express what our mutual interests are and to be able to reach a deal.
William Lee, Shen Yi, thank you so much, gentlemen, for your analysis of the latest development with TikTok deal. You're watching World Insight. Coming up in our program, our talks about the new Japanese Prime Minister, his possible policies for the Japanese society, and certainly at a very uncertain time of the world. Welcome back. This is World Insight with me, Tian Wei. Let's continue our discussion with the relations between China and Japan under a new Prime Minister. Chinese President Xi Jinping and Japanese Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga had their first phone conversation since Suga took office. Xi said the two sides share common interests, including regional peace and stability and an open, fair regional trade environment. Suga seeks to push bilateral ties to a new level. He said Tokyo would work with Beijing toward an economic partnership deal by the end of this year. Can bilateral ties indeed take off under the new Japanese Prime Minister? Let's loop in our panelists. For more on this, we are joined via Zoom in Beijing, Jia Daojun, professor from the School of International Studies with Peking University. In Japan, Tokyo, Naoyuki Yoshino, who is a professor emeritus with Keio University. Also in Tokyo, we have Benoit Hardy-Chartrand, the senior research associate with the Global Security and Political Center for International Governance Innovation. Welcome, gentlemen, to the program. Let me start by asking your general impression of the new Prime Minister of Japan since he comes into the power, both the cabinet makeup and also the recent announcement regarding the UN Security Council, as well as the Olympic Games. Let's have Professor Yoshino to go first.
Thank you very much. New Prime Minister Suga first originally came from countryside, and he went to evening university working outside. So he's very popular from many Japanese who has worked very hard to finish his university. And he has a slightly different stance in politics in overseas. But economics, he may succeed Abenomics, which Prime Minister Abe started. Japan's biggest problem is the aging population. That structural reform will be definitely needed. An Olympic game was scheduled this year. However, because of coronavirus, it has been postponed until next year. But we hope that Olympic game in Tokyo will be successful. However, the number of participants must be drastically declined. And I'm hoping Mr. Suga will have much better relations with China and compared to before. That's all my first comments.
Mr. Hardy-Chartrand, of course, on geopolitics, I go to you. Will that happen, a different approach, both regionally and geopolitically with the U.S. from this Prime Minister Suga?
I do not think we should expect much change from Prime Minister Suga, and as a matter of fact, this is one of the main reasons why he was the main choice of the LDP, and he was also the main choice of the outgoing Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. He represents really for Japan and for the LDP continuity. He represents stability, and he has, as a matter of fact, he vowed before or during one of his first addresses, Prime Minister Suga did vow to pursue generally the same policy lines as Prime Minister Abe did. Therefore, we can expect similar pursuits when it comes to foreign policy. We can continue to see probably efforts from Japan to continue to be a more active participant in the region when it comes to security issues, for example. However, I must add in the end that the priority for Prime Minister Suga, and he has said so Shinzo himself, is going to be reviving the Japanese economy, which has been badly affected by the pandemic crisis. So although we should expect a continuation of the Prime Minister Abe foreign policy, defense policies, his focus will be more than likely domestic issues.
Domestic issues and immediate issues, that seems to be very much on the agenda since he coming into the office. Professor Zhang, both about the pandemic, COVID-19, we see the numbers recently in Japan still on the rise, very worrisome, and certainly also sympathy from this part of the world toward Japan, and also the Olympic Games, which is likely to be a very different scale, a very different nature next year, even though it could be held. Let's just suggest that. Professor Zhang, your take.
Prime Minister Suga reminds me of an earlier Prime Minister of Japan, Keizo Oguchi, in the late 1990s. He's more an operative of the political system rather than a traditional politician in the Japanese context. I do believe his emergence as a prime minister indicates a desire for continuity, for having a steady hand in guiding Japan. We remember former Prime Minister Abe, Shinzo Abe. He is the longest serving Japanese Prime Minister, and immediately before him, Japan had 17 Prime Ministers within 14 years. So yes, there will be a lot of stability, hopefully, and the Olympics is of concern to not just Japan, but also China, because right after next year, we are looking forward to hosting the Winter Olympics here in China. The spirit of international solidarity and the spirit of humanity prevailing over these challenges from nature should be preserved.
Let me go to some specific questions. The economy, of course, I go to you, Professor Yoshino. The debt of Japan among the developed world regarding its GDP number, it's still huge, probably one of the biggest. Meanwhile, certainly nosedive economy as a result of pandemic and the uncertainty in geopolitics will be almost certain. So what do you think could be the way out? Is Prime Minister Suga experienced in that regard?
I think Prime Minister Suga should talk to the people. Balancing state spending and tax revenues are most important after this COVID-19 will be over. Secondly, Olympic Games will have much more expenses. However, many individuals would like to contribute their own money for Olympic Games. So I think second possibility is crowdfunding and getting money from individual donations. That could be possible, which can reduce budget deficits of the government.
Having said that, though, Professor Zhang, the Japanese economy has been somewhat stable still, given even though some of the challenges provided by Professor Yoshino in his answers. Meanwhile, we have seen Japan somewhat fulfilling a vacuum left by a withdrawing United States from international mechanism, about trade, about bilateral economic ties with China, about ASEAN. Tell me more, Professor Zhang, how much will this help a struggling Japanese economy, and how much does the soft power gained as a result would eventually help and support the Japanese image and the Japanese economy as a whole?
I think economics theories are behind the curve. In many ways, Abe economics, especially the raising of the debt ceiling for Japan, is now getting popularized around the world. We are in a very serious situation whereby what major economies, I mean the US, Japan, and certainly including China, they have to in many ways rely on growth in other economies outside their jurisdictions to have that circulation of spending and expense, to have that circulation to be sustainable. Now, the real question, I would think, that Japan and some other economies, including China, which is talking about matching internal circulation with external circulation, that's our slogans, is that now you have a bit of a withdrawal from the kind of globalization philosophy that was there before the pandemic, formally. So now what I'm really trying to say is with more of the industry chains being encouraged, in the case of Japan, to relocate back or to reshore, should we say, can that spur new employment? Can that spur new growth? It may mean more export, products to export from Japan to other economies, but what about the cost factor of the products? So we don't really have an easy answer. We'll have to wait and see.
There's another issue, of course, geopolitics. Mr. Hardy Chartrand, I want to invite you on this point. How do you see Prime Minister Suga, who is being regarded as quite a pragmatic person, how will he streamline at this critical, uncertain point about relations with China and relations with the United States?
No, absolutely. I think it's indeed Prime Minister Suga comes into power at a critical juncture, and relations with China are have been quite complicated since 2012, since the beginning of the Abe administration. But I think there is an effort that has already been made by Prime Minister Suga to make sure that relationships continue on the relatively positive track that we saw over the last few years. There was a phone call between Prime Minister Suga and President Xi over the last few days, and Suga said that he wanted to make sure to maintain stable relationships with China. He reiterated how important the relationships are with the two countries. So especially given right now how complicated the situation is with the pandemic, given the economic woes that Japan is going through, reinforcing ties with China is going to be an imperative, because Prime Minister Suga, as you rightly pointed out, is indeed a pragmatic.
We see earlier the Abe administration talking about two things. One, so-called the revision of the pacifist constitution, and the other so-called the normalization of its military. And at the end of his term, he has not delivered 100% on those political promises. Of course, China see it very differently. These two are not necessarily, in Chinese and the South Koreans' eyes, good for the peace and stability of the region. They hope Japan would remain a pacifist country that would, in their eyes, contribute to the continuation of peace in this region. Professor, about that point, do you see Prime Minister Suga will how shall I say, strong-mindedly take on those leftover tasks promised by the earlier Prime Minister? Or this is not likely to be the top of the agenda, no matter how geopolitics evolved?
Right. Well, I don't think this is going to be at the top of his agenda. Certainly, Prime Minister Suga has said that this would be that he would pursue the same policy objectives as Prime Minister Abe. So that included as well the amendment to the Constitution. We know that under the administration of Abe, there was a reinterpretation of the Constitution in 2014, and according to that reinterpretation, Japan can now exercise collective self-defense, which means it can come to the aid of its allies in the region, primarily the United States. Yeah. That was not a development that was welcome in China and in South Korea, which you pointed out earlier, because of historical issues between the three countries with regards to Imperial Japan's actions during and before World War II. I think certainly we can expect Suga to at least pay lip service to these efforts. He has said that he wanted to continue down that path, meaning making Japan, a more proactive contributor to peace in the region. It will be difficult, however, to continue down that path without eliciting too much resistance from both China and South Korea. And the other thing we have to keep in mind is, given that his footing or standing right now is only guaranteed for about another year, depending on when he calls for elections. During the next year, I think his priorities are certainly going to lie elsewhere, as I mentioned before. And for that reason, we are likely to see him try, perhaps put some efforts, but certainly not the kind of dogged determination that we witnessed Abe pursue these options with over the course of his 8 years in office.
Right. Professor Jia, you want to have your take here?
In the current international relations system, Japan as a sovereign nation has every right to do whatever it sees fit with its constitution. Linking back to what we were talking about the economy, I think the real challenge for Japan and by extension for China is how these political and constitutional changes get translated into spending. If you have a drastic increase in defense spending, that can have a escalating effect across the ocean here in China and probably elsewhere as well. If not, probably, and then plus with skillful and effective military diplomacy, then we may have managed, let's say, tensions to continue. But if I may, there is a lesson here but that's also true for China. If you look at the United States under President Trump, drastically increased its military spending. Come the pandemic, beginning with an unfortunate accident of one of the submarines catching the virus. You don't really have much of a defense. So wise spending and less of an let's say, devotion to sharpening your military tools would probably be the real challenge for all countries, not just Japan, actually.
Yeah. Struggling challenges for all of us, whether to focus more on the domestic agenda or more on geopolitics, taking the opportunist approach. Very interesting time. That's all I can say right now. Thank you so much, gentlemen, the three of you, helping us to understand much more in depth about this new prime minister in the office in Japan and his likely approach for the near future. Jia Daojun, Naoki Yoshino, and Benoit Hardy Chartrand. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. And be safe, everyone. For further study and discussion about Japan and new Prime Minister, Akio Takahala, professor from the Faculty of Law with the University of Tokyo. Professor Akio, good to see you after a long time.
Right, long time no see. It's very nice to be back on this program.
Professor Akio, an ultimate question facing China and Japan. Starting from earlier, but certainly right now, with what kind of framework and angle are we looking at each other?
Well, I suppose when we think about Japan-China relations, since we are both big countries, you are the second largest economy in the world, we are the third largest, and it's not possible just to discuss bilateral relations. Always it is in the context of regional international relations and global relations. So I think we need to talk about all aspects about our relationship.
If this administration comes into power in the U.S. After the election, there will be likely more pressure on Japan to face up to China in the region coming from Washington.
I don't think we will do whatever the U.S. will tell us to do. We have our own interests, we have our own position. Because our position is one in which we have to maintain and develop our relations with the United States on the one hand, but also we would like to have a good relationship with China on the other. And this basic position that Japan has is not going to change, whatever administration the U.S. is going to have. We shall do our best to defend our interests in promoting both the relationships with Washington and Beijing.
About TPP, though, Japan has taken quite a number of steps ahead in terms of rallying the crowd toward a platform. Of course, at this moment, the U.S. is not necessarily a voluntary supporter in that regard. How does Japan see its leadership and see the evolving of this platform vis-a-vis its relation with the United States and also vis-a-vis its trade relations with China, for example? Of course, China is not being invited into the conversation yet at this moment.
Well, you know, no country has been invited, so China is not an exception. As for Japan's basic position, of course, we promote free trade, and therefore we took the initiative in the CPTPP initiative after the U.S. left, which was a big pity for us because U.S. is such a big market, such a big player in the international trade, and therefore we would like whatever the next administration is going to be to come back to TPP, and in the future, when China is ready, of course we would welcome China to be an important member of the CPTPP.
Japan is going through some kinds of transition. Well, the world is at a great uncertainty. We see a new emperor coming into his time. And we also see now another change of the prime minister. So how do you see all of these changing factors in politics and societal life interact with one another in terms of Japan's near future?
Well, in fact, the biggest impact that our society has had is not the change in politics, but rather the COVID-19, the new coronavirus. This has had a big impact on society. We have realized how underdeveloped we've been in terms of digital technologies, you know, online education or business. So we are trying to make a very good use of this predicament that we've been in. So whether we can succeed in this transformation of our society, I think is the biggest interest that we have at the moment.
Meanwhile, Japan also have been systemically struggling with issues like foreign labor, you know, demographics. Of course, this prime minister only served in the office for 1 year before we know what's going to happen with the next political term. But on these longer-term issues, how do you see his role and the current administration so far?
Well, long-term issues, of course, are not easy to solve for any prime minister.
Yeah.
When it comes to the transformation of society or reforms in the basic institutions in society, I think it's not only the power of politicians or political parties, but rather the whole society must move, must come to an agreement and try to change ourselves. Of course, Mr. Suga, the new Prime Minister, I'm sure he will try and do his best, but we should not be too optimistic on those difficult questions.
About the mentalities of our region, we all have been talking about this is a ever-rising region, Asia, Northeast Asia, but on the other hand, there is reasons of history. There's also reasons of alliance, reasons of border that make the relationship always complicated. Overall speaking, what kind of mentality do you think Japan should have, and those in the Prime Minister's office should also adopt?
I suppose the big question is priority. You know, in each country, we should try and put our houses in order first. We should try and do better in solving the domestic issues that we have, and try not to make use of these diplomatic issues for your own political benefit. Let us put peace and cooperation, development, higher on the list of the agendas that each administration has, not only in Japan, but in China and in Korea, and that should make things better. That should smooth our relationships.
Final question, Professor Akio, before we go. China and U.S. is experiencing an interesting period of its relations. And many suggest this reminds them of a period of time between Japan and the United States. How do you see the recent one between China and U.S.? And its interesting logic vis-a-vis the one between Japan and U.S. decades ago.
Yes, there are some similarities. You know, the U.S., some people in the U.S. in the 1970s, 1980s, they were very much concerned that Japan was taking over the role that the U.S. had been playing. So they became very sensitive, they became very aggressive against Japan. And that kind of attitude we can see in how some people in the U.S. have been behaving towards the Chinese today. But there are differences. You know, when it comes to the bursting of the economic bubble that happened in Japan in the early 1990s, yes, some people have grudges against the U.S. You know, the Plaza Agreement in 1985 that raised the yen rate vis-a-vis the dollar. All those things were factors that triggered the bursting of the economic bubble. But many Japanese experts feel that that wasn't really the main cause of the trouble that we had, but rather mistakes in the Japanese economic policy making. And we could have avoided that crush that we experienced if we had acted in a wiser way. And I think in terms of economic policy, that's probably true. Now, the difference between U.S.-Japan and U.S.-China relations is that, of course, politically, Japan and U.S. are much closer. Security-wise, we are allies. But in the case of China-U.S., you have different political systems. Of course, you don't have a security alliance, so things become a lot more difficult. I tend to think that it will be even more difficult for China to solve this problem with the U.S. So everyone's rather concerned, since you two are the biggest economies in the world, and when you have a fight, that's going to affect us all. So a country like Japan, which has good relationships with both countries, we are always thinking what we can do. And Japan, when I come back to your initial question, will do its best to maintain our good ties with both Washington and Beijing.
Professor Akio Takahala from the University of Tokyo. Always a pleasure. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much.
China-Japan relations. That's all the time we have for today. If you'd like to see more, you can certainly search World Insight or check out our YouTube channel. Follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I'm Tian Wei on behalf of the team. Thanks for watching. Bye for now.